I was 28 years old, the night everything changed, standing in that cramped garage that had become my bedroom, staring at the foreclosure notice I'd just pulled from our mailbox. The concrete floor was cold beneath my bare feet, and the single space heater hummed its familiar tune in the corner, barely keeping the October chill at bay. What my family didn't know was that I had been quietly watching our financial situation spiral for months, and I had been preparing for this exact moment. They thought I was just Emma, the disappointment of the family, the one who couldn't even afford to live in the main house. They had no idea that I was about to become the person who owned the roof over their heads. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The garage had been my home for 3 years, ever since I graduated college and moved back to Riverside. It wasn't supposed to be permanent, just a temporary arrangement while I got back on my feet, but temporary had a way of becoming forever in my family. The space was barely 200 square feet, with exposed beams overhead and tools hanging from pegboard walls that my father David had installed decades ago. My bed was a twin mattress on a metal frame pushed against the far wall, next to a small dresser I'd bought secondhand and a folding table that served as my desk. The concrete walls were painted white, but the paint was chipping in places, revealing the gray beneath like old scars. My mother, Patricia, had made it clear from the beginning that this arrangement was charity, a favor she was doing for her youngest daughter who couldn't seem to get her life together. Never mind that I had graduated summa cum laude with a degree in finance, or that I had landed a position at Morrison & Associates, one of the most respected accounting firms in the county. In her eyes, I was still the girl who had chosen numbers over marriage, career over family, independence over what she considered a woman's proper place. The main house loomed just 20 feet away, a modest 2-story colonial with yellow siding and white trim that had seen better days. Through the kitchen window, I could see the warm glow of the chandelier my mother had insisted on buying when my older brother Marcus got promoted to site manager at the construction company. That chandelier cost more than I paid in rent for the garage, but pointing out such financial inconsistencies had never been welcome in family discussions. Marcus lived in the master bedroom upstairs with his wife Rebecca, who had made herself quite comfortable as the queen of the household, despite contributing nothing to the mortgage payments. Rebecca had a way of floating through the house in her designer athleisure wear, always holding a cup of coffee that seemed to be more prop than beverage, commenting on everything from the thread count of the towels to my mother's cooking. She treated the house like her personal kingdom, and me like the help who happened to share DNA. My younger sister Amanda occupied the second bedroom upstairs, the same room she'd had since childhood, painted lavender with white furniture that our parents had bought her for her 16th birthday. At 25, Amanda worked part-time at a boutique downtown and spent most of her earnings on clothes and weekend trips with friends. She had never paid rent, never contributed to utilities, and certainly never offered to help with the mortgage. The family had always treated her like their precious baby, even though she was only 3 years younger than me. I pushed the garage door opener, and the heavy metal door groaned upward, letting in the crisp evening air. The October sky was clear, stars visible despite the suburban streetlights, and I could hear the distant sound of traffic on Highway 91. This had become my routine after particularly difficult days at work or family dinners that left me feeling invisible. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I would sit on the concrete step just outside the garage door, looking up at the house where I had grown up but no longer belonged. The irony wasn't lost on me, that I had become an expert at managing other people's money while my own family treated me like a financial burden. At Morrison & Associates, I handled portfolios worth millions, advised clients on investment strategies, and had developed a reputation for turning around failing accounts. My supervisor had recently hinted at a promotion to senior analyst, which would come with a substantial salary increase and profit-sharing opportunities. But none of that seemed to matter at family dinners, where Marcus would hold court about his latest construction project, while Rebecca nodded admiringly, and my parents hung on every word. The foreclosure notice was dated 3 days ago, giving them 30 days to bring the mortgage current or face eviction proceedings. The amount owed was significant, but not insurmountable. at least not for someone who understood how to negotiate with lenders and navigate the foreclosure process. What struck me most was that nobody had mentioned it. Not during last Sunday's dinner when Rebecca was complaining about the water pressure in the upstairs shower. Not during my mother's phone call earlier this week when she spent 20 minutes describing her friend's new kitchen renovation. I folded the notice carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket. The garage was quiet, except for the steady tick of the old wall clock my father had hung near the workbench, its hands pointing to just past 11. The main house was dark now, everyone settled into their comfortable beds in their heated rooms with their private bathrooms and walk-in closets. I wondered if any of them had trouble sleeping, if the weight of unpaid bills and mounting debt kept them awake the way it would keep me awake if I were in their position. But I had learned not to volunteer financial advice or express concern about their money management. The last time I had gently suggested they might want to refinance at a lower interest rate, my father had bristled and told me to worry about my own situation before offering opinions about theirs. Rebecca had laughed and said something about how cute it was that I thought I understood real estate, as if my finance degree and professional experience were just amusing hobbies rather than actual expertise. That conversation had taken place 6 months ago, around the same time I had started quietly researching the property records for our address. It was public information, easily accessible through the county assessor's office, and what I discovered had been both shocking and enlightening. The house my parents had bought 32 years ago for $85,000 was now worth nearly $400,000, but they had refinanced so many times over the years that they owed almost $300,000 on the mortgage. They had taken cash out for home improvements, for Marcus's wedding, for Amanda's college tuition that she never finished, and for a dozen other expenses that had seemed important at the time. I had also discovered that they had missed payments before, not just recently but periodically over the past 5 years. Each time, they had managed to catch up just before the situation became critical, but the pattern suggested a family that was consistently living beyond their means while maintaining the appearance of financial stability. It explained why my mother had become increasingly sharp about my living situation, why my father had started making comments about my modest car and simple wardrobe, why Rebecca seemed determined to emphasize the difference between her status as Marcus's wife and my position as the daughter who had failed to launch. The space heater kicked on with a soft whoosh, filling the garage with warm air that smelled faintly of dust and motor oil. I had grown accustomed to the industrial smell, the way the concrete amplified every sound, the complete lack of privacy that came with living in a space that had never been designed for human habitation. But I had also grown to appreciate the solitude, the separation from the constant drama and competition that seemed to define life in the main house. From my desk in the corner, I pulled out a folder I had been maintaining for the past 8 months. Inside were bank statements, investment account summaries, and a detailed spreadsheet tracking my savings and expenditures. Working in finance had taught me the importance of documentation and long-term planning, skills that had served me well in building what I privately called my escape fund. What had started as a simple emergency savings account had grown into something much more substantial, thanks to careful budgeting, strategic investments, and the kind of disciplined spending that came from living in a garage while earning a professional salary. The numbers told a story that would have surprised anyone who knew me only as the family disappointment. Over the past 3 years, while paying minimal rent and living extremely modestly, I had managed to save nearly 60% of my income. The money that would have gone to expensive rent in my own apartment had instead gone into high-yield savings accounts and conservative investment portfolios. The money that would have been spent on furnishing and maintaining a proper home had been channeled into building wealth rather than accumulating possessions. More importantly, I had been learning about real estate investment, studying the local market, and building relationships with lenders and real estate professionals through my work at the firm. 6 months ago, I had been pre-approved for a mortgage that would have shocked my family if they had known about it. The lending officer had been impressed by my debt-to-income ratio, my credit score, and my substantial down payment fund. What I had told him I was looking for was an investment property, something that would generate rental income while building equity for the future. I had never mentioned to him that the property I was most interested in was the house where I currently lived in the garage, or that my interest wasn't entirely financial. There was something poetic about the idea of owning the place that had made me feel like an outsider for so long. of holding the power that my family had always assumed belonged to someone else. But poetry aside, it was also a sound investment opportunity, especially if I could acquire the property below market value through a foreclosure purchase. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, officially making it Thursday. In exactly 4 weeks, if nothing changed, my family would be facing eviction proceedings. They would have to pack their belongings, find new places to live, and watch while strangers took possession of the house that had been the center of their world for more than 3 decades. Marcus and Rebecca would have to find their own place, probably a small apartment that Rebecca would hate after years of treating the family home like her personal mansion. Amanda would have to move in with friends or finally get a full-time job that could support an independent lifestyle. My parents would face the humiliation of losing their home in their early 60s, with limited options for starting over. Unless, of course, someone stepped in to save them. Someone who understood the foreclosure process, who had the financial resources to handle the situation, and who was willing to help the family navigate this crisis. Someone like their daughter, who worked in finance and had been quietly preparing for exactly this opportunity. I closed the folder and slipped it back into the desk drawer, then walked to the small mirror hanging near the makeshift closet I had created with a tension rod and a curtain. The woman looking back at me was tired but determined, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her clothes simple but well-fitted. I looked like exactly what I was, a professional woman in her late 20s who had learned to prioritize substance over appearance, who had traded comfort for opportunity, and who was about to demonstrate that underestimating someone could be a very expensive mistake. Tomorrow morning, I would go to work as usual, handle my clients' accounts with the same attention to detail that had built my reputation, and attend the staff meeting where my promotion would likely be announced. Tomorrow evening, I would come home to the garage, heat up a simple dinner, and listen to the sounds of family life filtering through the walls of the main house. But very soon, probably within the next week, I would be making a phone call that would change everything. The foreclosure notice crinkled slightly in my pocket as I turned off the space heater and prepared for bed. In 30 days, my family would learn what it felt like to have their security depend entirely on someone else's generosity. They would discover that the daughter they had relegated to the garage, the sister they had treated as a failure, and the family member they had consistently overlooked had become the most important person in their lives. And for the first time in 3 years, I was genuinely excited about what tomorrow might bring. The promotion came through on Friday morning, exactly as I had expected. Jennifer Morrison, the firm's senior partner, called me into her corner office with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Riverside. The morning light streamed across her mahogany desk as she delivered the news with the kind of professional warmth that made her one of the most respected financial advisors in Southern California. "Emma, your performance over the past 18 months has been exceptional," she said, sliding a folder across the desk toward me. "The Henderson portfolio turnaround alone saved us a major client relationship, and your risk assessment strategies have consistently outperformed industry standards. We're promoting you to senior financial analyst, effective immediately." The salary increase was substantial, nearly 40% more than my current income, with additional performance bonuses and profit-sharing opportunities that could easily double my earning potential within 2 years. As Jennifer walked me through the benefits package and new responsibilities, I found myself calculating how this change would affect my investment timeline. The extra income would accelerate my savings rate even further, but more importantly, it would strengthen my position with lenders and provide additional leverage for the conversation I was planning to have with my family very soon. "There is one additional opportunity I'd like to discuss with you," Jennifer continued, her expression shifting to something more confidential. "We've been approached by Pacific Trust Bank about handling some of their distressed property acquisitions. They're looking for an analyst who can evaluate foreclosure opportunities and advise on profitable investments. Given your background and your particular expertise with residential properties, I think you'd be perfect for this project." The irony was almost too perfect to believe. Pacific Trust Bank held the mortgage on my family's house, and now I would potentially be working directly with them on foreclosure acquisitions. What Jennifer didn't know, and what I had no intention of revealing, was that I had been monitoring their foreclosure listings for months and had already identified several properties that would make excellent investment opportunities. "I'm very interested," I told her, keeping my voice professionally neutral despite the excitement building in my chest. "When would you need an answer?" "Take the weekend to think about it," she said. It would mean some additional travel, probably 1 or 2 days per week, but the compensation package is quite generous. Plus, it would position you perfectly for partnership consideration within the next 3 to 5 years. I left her office with a new business card that read, Emma Rodriguez, Senior Financial Analyst, and a salary that would have shocked my family if they had any idea what I actually earned. The administrative assistant had already updated my nameplate and email signature by the time I returned to my desk, and several colleagues stopped by throughout the morning to offer congratulations. By lunch, word had spread through the office that I was being considered for the Pacific Trust Bank project, and the respect in people's voices when they spoke to me was something I had never experienced at home. The drive back to Riverside that evening gave me time to process everything that had happened and to finalize the plan I had been developing for weeks. The foreclosure notice gave my family 30 days, but I knew from experience that most people waited until the last possible moment to take action, hoping that some miracle would solve their problems without requiring them to make difficult decisions or uncomfortable changes. My family was exactly the type to wait, to assume that something would work out, to avoid facing the reality of their situation until they had no other choice. But I wasn't going to wait for them to come to me. Over the weekend, I would make the necessary phone calls and arrange the meetings that would put everything in motion. By Monday morning, I would have all the pieces in place for a conversation that would change our family dynamic forever. The only question was whether I would give them advance warning or let the revelation come as a complete surprise. The garage felt different when I arrived home that evening. The same concrete floors, the same makeshift furniture, the same industrial smell of motor oil and dust, but somehow the space felt temporary now rather than permanent. I had lived here for 3 years, adapting to the cold in winter and the stifling heat in summer, making do with a shared bathroom in the main house and a kitchen that I was only welcome to use at designated times. But now I could see an end to this arrangement, a future where I would never again have to ask permission to take a shower or apologize for the space I occupied. Through the window that connected the garage to the main house, I could see my family gathered around the dinner table. Marcus was animated about something, gesturing with his fork while Rebecca nodded and smiled in that practiced way of hers. Amanda was scrolling through her phone, barely paying attention to the conversation, while my parents listened with the kind of focused attention they reserve for their son's stories about work. The scene looked warm and comfortable, like something from a family sitcom, but I had long since stopped feeling excluded from moments like this. Instead, I felt like an observer studying subjects for a research project. I watched the way Marcus dominated the conversation, how Rebecca positioned herself as the supportive wife who was too important to help clear the table, how Amanda was indulged in her disengagement while my parents competed for their attention. This was the family dynamic that had existed for years, the carefully maintained hierarchy that put me at the bottom and everyone else in positions they felt entitled to maintain. What they didn't realize was that hierarchy was about to be completely inverted. I heated up leftover Chinese takeout from earlier in the week and settled at my folding table with a legal pad and pen. Making lists had always helped me think clearly, and tonight I needed to organize my thoughts for the most important negotiation of my life. At the top of the page, I wrote property acquisition strategy and began outlining the key points I would need to address. First, there was the matter of timing. The foreclosure notice gave them 30 days, but I knew from my professional experience that the process could be extended if the homeowners showed good faith efforts to resolve the situation. If I contacted Pacific Trust Bank early in the process, I could potentially negotiate a pre-foreclosure purchase that would save them the expense and time of formal proceedings while giving me a better price than I might get at auction. Second, there was the question of how much information to share with my family and when. I could approach them directly, explain that I was aware of their situation, and offer to help by purchasing the property myself. This would give them the opportunity to stay in the house as my tenants, probably at below market rent, while I built equity and rental income. It would be a generous solution that kept the family together while establishing me as their benefactor rather than their burden. Alternatively, I could handle the purchase quietly, through the bank and real estate professionals, and then present my family with the fait accompli after the transaction was complete. This approach would be more dramatic and would certainly drive home the point that they had seriously underestimated my capabilities, but it would also be more traumatic for everyone involved. The third consideration was what kind of landlord I wanted to be. I could treat this purely as a business transaction, charging market-rate rent and maintaining professional boundaries with my tenants who happen to be my family members. Or I could use my position to gradually reshape our family dynamic, setting reasonable expectations for respect and contribution while providing the stability they clearly couldn't maintain on their own. As I worked through these scenarios, I found myself thinking about all the small humiliations I had endured over the past 3 years. The times Rebecca had made pointed comments about my temporary living situation in front of her friends. The family gatherings where my opinions about financial matters were dismissed or ignored, even though I was the only one with actual expertise in the subject. The casual way my parents had begun referring to the garage as Emma's room, as if I had chosen this arrangement rather than having it imposed on me by circumstance and their unwillingness to treat me as an equal adult child. There had been the morning 6 months ago when I had come into the kitchen to make coffee before work, only to find Rebecca entertaining her book club friends with mimosas and pastries spread across the counter. She had looked at me with obvious annoyance and said, "Oh, Emma, we're using the kitchen right now. Could you maybe get your coffee later?" As if I were an inconvenient roommate rather than a family member who lived here and contributed to the household expenses. Or the evening last Christmas when Marcus had announced that he and Rebecca were planning to renovate the master bathroom, installing a luxury shower and heated floors. The cost was clearly beyond what they could afford on his construction manager's salary. But when I had quietly suggested that it might be wise to prioritize paying down the mortgage before taking on additional debt, my father had told me that homeownership involved decisions I wouldn't understand until I had property of my own. The irony of that comment would be particularly sweet when I became the person who owned the property where they all lived. I finished my notes and walked outside for some fresh air, stepping into the small courtyard area between the garage and the main house. The October night was clear and cool, with the kind of crisp air that made everything seem possible. From here, I could see into the living room window, where my family had moved after dinner. Marcus and Rebecca were on the couch, her feet in his lap while they watched something on the large-screen television that had been a necessity purchase earlier this year. Amanda was in the armchair, still absorbed in her phone, while my parents shared the love seat with the newspaper spread between them. They looked content, settled, secure in their assumption that their lives would continue exactly as they always had. None of them seemed burdened by worry about the foreclosure notice that was probably still sitting in the stack of mail my mother habitually left on the kitchen counter until the weekend. None of them appeared to be losing sleep over unpaid bills or considering what they might need to sacrifice to keep their home. But then, none of them had ever learned to take responsibility for problems they couldn't solve by simply ignoring them. That had always been my role in the family, the practical one who thought ahead and planned for contingencies. Except, this time, instead of planning to help them solve their problems, I was planning to become their solution in a way they never could have imagined. Saturday morning brought the kind of perfect California weather that made it easy to understand why people paid premium prices to live here. I woke early, as had become my habit, and spent an hour on the small exercise bike I had wedged into the corner of the garage. Physical fitness was one of the few luxuries I had maintained during my time here, partly because it was a relatively inexpensive way to manage stress, and partly because I had learned that professional success often required the stamina to work long hours and maintain focus under pressure. By 8 o'clock, I was dressed in my best business casual outfit and ready to make the phone calls that would set everything in motion. I had decided on a hybrid approach to the situation, one that would give me maximum flexibility while keeping my family informed enough to understand what was happening without necessarily understanding my role until I was ready to reveal it. The first call was to my contact at Pacific Trust Bank, a senior loan officer named Robert Chen, who had worked with several of my clients on refinancing and investment property purchases. Robert was professional, discreet, and most importantly, he understood the value of working with financial professionals who could bring him qualified buyers for distressed properties. "Robert, it's Emma Rodriguez from Morrison & Associates," I said when he answered his direct line. "I hope you're having a good weekend. I wanted to follow up on our conversation about investment opportunities in the Riverside area. Emma, good to hear from you, he replied. Are you looking at something specific, or do you want me to send you our current foreclosure listings? Actually, there's a particular property I've been monitoring, and I noticed it just entered pre-foreclosure status. The address is 1247 Maple Street. I'm wondering if you might be open to discussing a pre-foreclosure purchase arrangement. There was a brief pause while Robert presumably pulled up the file on his computer. Ah, yes, the Rodriguez property. Interesting coincidence with the last name. Are you familiar with this property personally? You could say that, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. I've done extensive research on the neighborhood and the property values in that area. I think it would be an excellent addition to my investment portfolio, especially if we could structure the purchase to benefit all parties involved. What followed was a detailed conversation about property values, outstanding debt, and the timeline for potential foreclosure proceedings. Robert confirmed what I had already suspected. My family owed significantly more than they could pay in a lump sum, but the amount was well within my purchasing power, especially with the favorable financing terms available to qualified investors like myself. The current owners haven't contacted us about workout options, Robert mentioned. In my experience, most people in this situation wait until the last possible moment to reach out, which usually limits their options significantly. If you're serious about this property, I'd recommend moving quickly to get ahead of the formal foreclosure process. We scheduled a meeting for Tuesday morning to discuss specific terms and timeline. Robert would prepare a comprehensive financial analysis of the property, including estimated repair costs and market value comparisons, while I would provide documentation of my financing capacity and investment portfolio. By the end of the call, we had established a framework for a transaction that could be completed within 2 weeks, well before my family's 30-day deadline. The second call was to my real estate agent, Maria Santos, who had been helping me monitor investment opportunities for the past 6 months. Maria was exactly the kind of professional I respected: knowledgeable, efficient, and completely focused on her clients' financial interest rather than their personal drama. When I explained that I was ready to move forward with a specific property purchase, she immediately shifted into action mode. Do you want me to schedule a formal inspection? She asked. Even if you're familiar with the property, we should document its condition for financing and insurance purposes. This was where the situation became slightly delicate. I obviously couldn't have Maria show up at my family's door with a clipboard and measuring tape without explaining why their daughter was having their house professionally evaluated for purchase. But I also needed the inspection documentation to complete the transaction properly. Let me handle the inspection arrangements, I told her. The current owners are going through a difficult time, and I want to make sure we approach this sensitively. Can you recommend an inspector who would be willing to work with unusual scheduling requirements? Maria understood immediately. In her experience, foreclosure situations often involved family complications and emotional sensitivities that required careful handling. She gave me the contact information for an inspector who specialized in pre-foreclosure evaluations and was accustomed to working around difficult family dynamics. By noon, I had spoken with the inspector, scheduled a preliminary assessment for the following weekend, and begun assembling the financial documents I would need for the purchase. Everything was moving forward exactly as I had planned, with one crucial element still to be determined: when and how to tell my family what was happening. That decision was made for me on Sunday afternoon, when I overheard a conversation that crystallized everything I had been feeling for the past 3 years. I was in the garage, working on my laptop and enjoying the quiet of the weekend, when voices from the main house began filtering through the thin walls. The family was gathered in the living room, probably for their usual Sunday afternoon ritual of coffee and gossip, but today their voices were more animated than usual. I just don't understand why she's still here, Rebecca was saying, her tone carrying the particular edge it got when she was building up to one of her pronouncements. I mean, she's 28 years old. Most people her age have their own apartments, their own lives. It's not normal for an adult to be living in her parents' garage. She pays rent, my mother replied, but her voice lacked conviction. And it's convenient having her here to help with things around the house. Rebecca laughed, a sound that managed to be both amused and dismissive. Help with what? She's never here except to sleep. And when she is here, she acts like she's doing us a favor just by existing. Honestly, Patricia, I think you and David have been too generous. Some people need to be pushed out of the nest, you know? My father's voice joined the conversation, heavier and more resigned. Maybe Rebecca's right. Emma's always been too comfortable with other people solving her problems. Look at this whole living situation. Instead of figuring out how to afford her own place, she's just settled into the easy option. The easy option. I had to pause my typing to process that phrase. Living in a converted garage with no privacy, no proper kitchen, and no heating system beyond a space heater was the easy option compared to what, exactly? Renting an apartment that would cost 3 times what I paid to live here? Moving to a different city where my rent wouldn't subsidize their lifestyle? But Marcus was just getting started. The problem is, she doesn't really contribute anything meaningful to the family. She's just kind of there, taking up space, paying minimal rent, acting like she's some kind of financial expert because she works at an accounting firm. But if she was actually good with money, wouldn't she have her own place by now? Amanda chimed in with the casual cruelty that she had perfected over the years. It's embarrassing when my friends ask about her. What am I supposed to say? That my older sister lives in our garage and thinks she's too good to hang out with the family? She's like this weird hermit who happens to be related to us. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with each family member contributing their own theories about my failures and inadequacies. According to them, I was lazy, antisocial, financially irresponsible, and generally disappointing as both a daughter and a sister. The consensus seemed to be that I was taking advantage of their generosity, and that it was time for them to stop enabling my supposed inability to function as an independent adult. What struck me most wasn't the unfairness of their assessment, although it was remarkably unfair, but the complete disconnect between their perception of the situation and the reality of what was about to happen. In their minds, I was the family member who needed to be managed, guided, and eventually pushed towards self-sufficiency. They saw themselves as the responsible adults who had been carrying me for too long. In less than 2 weeks, they would discover that I was actually the only one among them who was financially capable of maintaining the lifestyle they had all taken for granted. They would learn that their supposed generosity in letting me live in the garage had actually been subsidizing their ability to keep a house they couldn't afford. And they would have to confront the fact that their future security depended entirely on the goodwill of the family member they had just spent 20 minutes describing as a burden and an embarrassment. I closed my laptop and walked outside into the afternoon sunshine. The neighborhood was quiet, with the peaceful Sunday atmosphere of families enjoying their weekends in their comfortable homes. Children were playing in yards, neighbors were washing cars or working in gardens, and everyone seemed secure in the assumption that their lives would continue exactly as they were. But appearances could be deceiving, and assumptions could be very expensive mistakes. My family was about to learn both of those lessons in the most personal way possible. Tuesday morning couldn't come fast enough. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made everything feel sharper, more focused. I had barely slept. Not from anxiety, but from anticipation. The meeting with Robert Chen at Pacific Trust Bank was scheduled for 10 o'clock, and I had spent the early hours reviewing every document in my portfolio, ensuring that my presentation would be flawless. This wasn't just a business transaction anymore. It was the moment when I would begin to reshape the power dynamics that had defined my family for decades. The bank's corporate offices were located in a sleek glass building downtown, the kind of place where serious money changed hands every day. I arrived 15 minutes early, wearing my best charcoal gray suit and carrying a leather portfolio that contained everything Robert would need to approve the purchase. The lobby was all marble and chrome, with the quiet efficiency that spoke of institutional wealth and professional discretion. Robert Chen met me in the lobby exactly at 10, extending his hand with the kind of firm handshake that sealed million-dollar deals. He was perhaps 45, impeccably dressed, with the confident bearing of someone who had navigated thousands of complex financial transactions. As we rode the elevator to his office on the 12th floor, he made polite conversation about the weather and the local real estate market, but I could sense his professional curiosity about this particular deal. His office overlooked the downtown area, with floor-to-ceiling windows that provided a panoramic view of Riverside's business district. The walls were lined with awards and certificates, testaments to his expertise in commercial lending and investment finance. When we settled into the leather chairs around his conference table, Robert opened a thick file that I recognized immediately as the complete financial history of my family's property. "Before we begin," he said, spreading documents across the table, "I want to make sure I understand your interest in this particular property. The location is excellent, and the neighborhood has shown consistent appreciation over the past decade, but there are certainly other investment opportunities in the same price range that might offer better rental yields." I had prepared for this question, knowing that Robert was too experienced to simply accept a client's interest without understanding the underlying motivation. "I've done extensive research on that specific block," I replied. "The properties on either side have recently sold for significantly more than their assessed values, and I believe this house is underpriced relative to its potential. Additionally, I'm familiar with the property's maintenance history and structural condition, which reduces my risk as an investor." What I didn't mention was that my familiarity came from 3 years of living in the garage and observing every repair, every upgrade, and every corner that my family had cut to save money. I knew which windows leaked during heavy rain, which electrical outlets were overloaded, and which sections of the roof would need attention within the next few years. I also knew that the house had good bones beneath its cosmetic problems, and that with proper maintenance and modest investments, it could easily appreciate faster than comparable properties. Robert nodded approvingly as he reviewed my financial documentation. My credit score was exceptional, my debt-to-income ratio was well below lending guidelines, and my down payment fund was more than sufficient to secure favorable terms. The promotion at Morrison & Associates had only strengthened my profile as a borrower, and the additional income from the Pacific Trust Bank consulting project would provide extra security for the monthly payments. The current owners owe approximately $278,000 on the existing mortgage, Robert explained, sliding a detailed breakdown across the table. They're currently 4 months behind on payments, with additional penalties and fees bringing the total arrearage to just over $37,000. At this point, we have 2 options for proceeding. He outlined the first scenario, which involved allowing the foreclosure process to continue through the courts. This would take approximately 6 to 8 weeks, during which time the property would be listed for auction. The minimum bid would be set at the outstanding loan balance, but if no qualified bidders emerged, the bank would take possession and eventually list the property through traditional real estate channels. The second option, Robert continued, is what we call a pre-foreclosure negotiated sale. In this scenario, we work directly with a qualified buyer to complete the purchase before the legal proceedings are finalized. This saves the bank the expense and uncertainty of the auction process, while giving the current owners an opportunity to avoid the credit damage of a completed foreclosure. The numbers were exactly what I had hoped to hear. Through a pre-foreclosure purchase, I could acquire the property for approximately $290,000, which included paying off the existing mortgage balance and covering the associated fees. Given that comparable properties in the neighborhood were selling for well over $350,000, this represented an immediate equity gain of more than $60,000. More importantly, the transaction could be completed within 10 days, well before my family's 30-day deadline. This meant I could present them with a solution to their crisis while simultaneously establishing myself as their new landlord. The poetic justice of the situation was almost overwhelming. "There is one procedural requirement," Robert mentioned as we reviewed the preliminary purchase agreement. "We need to provide the current owners with formal notification of the pending sale. This gives them 72 hours to either bring their account current or accept the inevitable change in ownership." This was the moment I had been both anticipating and dreading. Within 3 days, my family would receive an official letter from Pacific Trust Bank, informing them that their house was being sold to a private investor. They would have to confront the reality of their financial situation and begin making plans for their future as tenants rather than homeowners. What they wouldn't know, at least not immediately, was the identity of their new landlord. I signed the preliminary documents and authorized Robert to begin the formal purchase process. The bank's legal department would prepare the necessary paperwork, order a professional appraisal, and schedule the final closing for the following Tuesday. By the end of the week, I would own the house where I had been living in the garage for the past 3 years. The drive back to Morrison and Associates felt surreal, as if I were moving through a world that had suddenly become more malleable, more responsive to my will. For so long, I had felt like a passive participant in my own life, accepting whatever circumstances my family created and adapting to their expectations and limitations. But now I was actively shaping those circumstances, making decisions that would affect all of them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The afternoon at work passed quickly, filled with client meetings and portfolio reviews that felt almost trivial compared to the magnitude of what I had set in motion that morning. My colleagues congratulated me again on the promotion, and Jennifer Morrison stopped by my office to discuss the Pacific Trust Bank consulting project in more detail. The irony wasn't lost on me that I would potentially be advising the bank on other foreclosure acquisitions while simultaneously becoming one of their foreclosure buyers. "There's something I particularly appreciate about your approach to these situations," Jennifer said as we reviewed the project parameters. "You understand that behind every financial transaction there are real people dealing with real consequences. That empathy, combined with your analytical skills, makes you particularly effective at finding solutions that work for everyone involved." If only she knew how personal this particular transaction had become, and how much my empathy had been shaped by years of experiencing those consequences firsthand. Wednesday morning brought the first crack in my family's facade of financial stability. I was having coffee in the garage before work when I heard raised voices coming from the kitchen of the main house. Through the connecting window, I could see my parents standing at the counter with several pieces of mail spread between them, their faces grim with the kind of expression that comes from reading news you've been dreading. My father was holding what looked like an official letter, probably the notification from Pacific Trust Bank that Robert had mentioned. My mother was gripping the edge of the counter, her knuckles white with tension. Even from a distance, I could see the stress radiating from both of them as they processed the reality of their situation. "How much time do we have?" my mother was asking, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. 72 hours to catch up on the payments," my father replied, his voice heavy with defeat. "Otherwise, the house goes to this investor who wants to buy it." Amanda appeared in the kitchen, still in her pajamas, drawn by the urgency in their voices. "What's going on?" she asked, then saw the letter in my father's hand. "Oh no. Is this about the mortgage?" My mother nodded, unable to speak. Amanda sank into one of the kitchen chairs, suddenly looking much younger than her 25 years. "What are we going to do?" she whispered. "I don't know," my father admitted, and in those 3 words I heard decades of financial decisions finally catching up with him. We'd need almost $40,000 to bring everything current. Even if we could get a loan, there's no way to arrange that kind of money in 3 days. Marcus and Rebecca appeared a few minutes later, probably awakened by the commotion. Rebecca was perfectly put together. Despite the early hour, her hair styled and makeup applied as if she were expecting photographers. Marcus looked more disheveled, clearly struggling to process the crisis that was unfolding around him. "There has to be something we can do," Rebecca said, her voice carrying the particular tone she used when she expected other people to solve problems for her. "Can't you talk to the bank? Explain that you just need a little more time?" My father shook his head wearily. "We've already had several extensions. They've been more than patient. At this point, they need to see actual payment, not promises." "What about a second mortgage?" Marcus suggested. "Or a home equity loan?" "We already took out everything we could against the house," my mother said quietly. "There's no equity left to borrow against." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with each family member proposing increasingly desperate solutions that demonstrated how little they understood about their actual financial situation. Nobody mentioned asking me for advice, despite the fact that I was the only one among them with professional expertise in exactly this type of crisis. They were so accustomed to dismissing my opinions that it didn't occur to them that I might have insights worth considering. More telling was their complete focus on finding ways to maintain their current lifestyle without making any fundamental changes. Nobody suggested that Marcus and Rebecca should move to their own apartment to reduce household expenses. Nobody proposed that Amanda should get a full-time job or start contributing to the family finances. Nobody considered the possibility that they might need to downsize, relocate, or fundamentally alter their standard of living. Instead, they talked about borrowing more money, extending the crisis rather than resolving it, and finding ways to continue living beyond their means. It was exactly the kind of magical thinking that had created this situation in the first place, and it confirmed my growing conviction that dramatic intervention was necessary. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I found myself standing in the small courtyard between the garage and the main house, looking up at the windows that glowed with warm yellow light. In a few days, those windows would still glow warmly, but the people behind them would be my tenants, rather than my family members who barely tolerated my presence. The shift in power would be absolute and irreversible. Instead of paying minimal rent for a converted garage, I would be collecting rent from all of them for the privilege of living in rooms they currently took for granted. Instead of being the family member who needed to be managed and eventually pushed toward independence, I would be the person who determined whether they could stay in the only home they had known for decades. But with that power would come responsibility, and choices that would define what kind of person I wanted to be. I could use my position to extract revenge for years of condescension and dismissal. I could set rental terms that would force them to confront the reality of their financial limitations. I could establish rules and boundaries that would make them as uncomfortable as they had made me. Or I could use this opportunity to build the kind of family relationships I had always wanted, based on mutual respect and genuine appreciation rather than hierarchy and assumption. I could create a situation where everyone contributed fairly and everyone was valued for what they brought to the household. I could demonstrate the kind of generosity and leadership that I had never received but had always hoped to experience. The choice was entirely mine, and it was a choice that my family would live with for years to come. Thursday brought a strange sense of calm to the main house, the kind of artificial peace that settles over a family when everyone has agreed to pretend that a crisis isn't happening. My parents went through their normal routines, my father leaving for his part-time consulting work and my mother tending to her garden and household tasks. Marcus headed to the construction site where he supervised crews, while Rebecca maintained her schedule of yoga classes and coffee dates with friends. Amanda left for her shift at the boutique, chatting cheerfully on her phone as if nothing had changed. But I could see the tension beneath their performances. My mother's movements were more aggressive than usual as she cleaned the kitchen, scrubbing surfaces that were already spotless. My father spent an unusual amount of time standing at the living room window, staring out at the street with the expression of someone waiting for either salvation or disaster. Even Rebecca seemed slightly off her game, checking her phone more frequently and speaking in shorter, sharper sentences. None of them had asked for my help or advice, despite the fact that I walked past them multiple times throughout the morning and evening. They maintained their collective fiction that this was a problem for the adults to handle, even though their track record for handling financial problems was what had created the current emergency. Friday morning brought the second notice from Pacific Trust Bank, this one more formal and final than the first. I watched from the garage as my father retrieved the mail, saw his shoulders slump as he recognized the official envelope, and witnessed the moment when hope finally gave way to resignation. This time, the family meeting in the kitchen was quieter, more somber. The 72-hour deadline had passed, and there would be no miraculous last-minute reprieve. The house would be sold to the private investor, and they would have to begin making plans for their future as tenants or find somewhere else to live entirely. "The new owner wants to meet with us on Monday," my father announced, reading from the letter, "to discuss lease terms and occupancy arrangements." "What kind of lease terms?" Rebecca asked, and for the first time since I had known her, she sounded genuinely worried rather than merely inconvenienced. "We won't know until we meet with them," my mother replied, "but we need to be prepared for the possibility that they might want us to move out entirely." The prospect of displacement finally broke through Amanda's usual self-absorption. "Where would we go?" she asked, and the question hung in the air like a weight that none of them were prepared to carry. "We'll figure something out," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe we can find a rental house in the same neighborhood. Or apartments. We'll manage." But I knew, as they were beginning to realize, that managing would require sacrifices none of them had ever contemplated. Marcus and Rebecca would need to find a place they could afford on his construction manager's salary alone. Amanda would need to either contribute significantly more to household expenses or find roommates willing to subsidize her part-time income. My parents would face the challenge of rebuilding their lives in their early 60s, with damaged credit and limited resources. The meeting with their new landlord was scheduled for Monday at 10 o'clock at the house itself. What they didn't know was that their new landlord would be arriving from the garage, walking the 20 feet from her current bedroom to the living room, where she had never been invited to participate in important family decisions. Saturday and Sunday passed with an eerie combination of normalcy and underlying tension. The family went through their usual weekend routines, but conversations were shorter and more careful, as if everyone was afraid of saying something that might make their situation feel more real. Rebecca spent most of Saturday at the mall, probably engaging in the kind of retail therapy that would be impossible once her housing costs increased substantially. Amanda invited friends over for what felt like a farewell gathering, though she hadn't explicitly acknowledged it as such. Marcus worked in the yard, trimming bushes and cleaning the garage in what seemed like an attempt to improve the property's appeal to their new landlord. The irony wasn't lost on me that he was essentially preparing my current living space for inspection by someone he didn't realize was watching him through the window. By Sunday evening, the house felt like a stage set waiting for the final act of a play that had been building toward this moment for years. Everyone was in their assigned positions, playing their familiar roles, but the script was about to change in ways that none of them could anticipate. I spent the evening reviewing the lease agreements that Maria Santos had prepared, documents that would formalize the new relationship between me and the people who had been my family but would now be my tenants. The terms were fair but firm, reflecting market rates for comparable properties, while including provisions that would ensure respectful treatment of both the property and its owner. Monday morning would bring revelations that would reshape everything my family thought they knew about power, respect, and the true meaning of financial security. They were about to discover that the daughter they had relegated to the garage was actually the person who would determine their future in the house they had always taken for granted. The transformation would be absolute, immediate, and irreversible. And I was ready. Monday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. I had been awake since 5, not from nerves, but from the kind of electric anticipation that comes before a moment you've planned for months finally arrives. The garage felt different somehow, like a launching pad rather than a prison, and every familiar detail seemed to carry new significance. The concrete floor that had been so cold beneath my feet, the pegboard walls lined with my father's tools, the space heater that had been my only defense against winter nights. All of it would soon be part of my property rather than my temporary refuge. At exactly 9:30, I heard the unmistakable sound of my family gathering in the living room. Chairs were being moved, voices were lowered to the careful tones people use when they're preparing for difficult conversations, and there was an underlying current of nervous energy that felt like electricity before a storm. Through the window that connected the garage to the main house, I could see my mother adjusting cushions on the couch for the 3rd time, while my father stood near the mantelpiece with his hands clasped behind his back in the posture he adopted when he was trying to project authority he wasn't sure he possessed. Rebecca had dressed for the occasion in what I recognized as her most expensive business outfit, a navy blue suit that she typically reserved for important social events or job interviews. She was seated in the armchair closest to the front door, positioned as if she were the family's designated spokesperson, rather than the daughter-in-law, who had never contributed a dollar to the mortgage she was now desperate to preserve. Marcus stood behind her chair, one hand resting protectively on her shoulder, both of them presenting a united front against whatever changes were about to disrupt their comfortable world. Amanda had chosen a different strategy, arriving in jeans and a casual sweater that seemed designed to emphasize her youth and vulnerability. She perched on the edge of the sofa next to my mother, fidgeting with her phone in a way that suggested she was either documenting the moment for social media or simply trying to distract herself from the gravity of the situation. Her usual confidence had been replaced by something that looked almost like fear, and for the first time in years, she seemed to understand that her actions might have consequences she couldn't charm her way out of. At exactly 10 o'clock, I stood up from the folding chair where I had been reviewing my documents one final time, smoothed my professional dress, and picked up the leather portfolio that contained the lease agreements and property transfer papers. The walk from the garage to the front door of the main house took less than 30 seconds, but it felt like crossing a bridge between two entirely different versions of my life. I knocked on the front door of what was now my own house, a formality that felt both absurd and absolutely necessary. The symbolism was important. I wasn't entering as Emma, the disappointing daughter who lived in the garage, but as Emma Rodriguez, the property owner, who was about to conduct a business meeting with her new tenants. Marcus opened the door, and the expression on his face when he saw me was something I would remember for the rest of my life. Confusion came first, then recognition, then a kind of dawning horror, as his brain began to process the impossible reality of what he was seeing. His mouth opened and closed without producing any sound, and he took an involuntary step backward, as if I were carrying some kind of contagious disease. "Good morning, Marcus," I said pleasantly, extending my hand for a professional handshake. "I'm Emma Rodriguez. I believe you're expecting me." The silence that followed was profound and complete. Even Amanda stopped fidgeting with her phone, her attention captured by the sight of her sister standing in the doorway dressed like a businesswoman, and speaking with the kind of calm authority none of them had ever heard from me before. Rebecca's carefully composed expression cracked slightly, revealing something that might have been panic beneath her professional facade. My mother was the first to find her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Emma, I don't understand. What are you doing here?" "I'm here for our 10 o'clock meeting," I replied, consulting my watch with deliberate precision. "I believe Pacific Trust Bank notified you that the new property owner wanted to discuss lease terms and occupancy arrangements." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, and I watched as each family member processed the information at their own speed. My father's face went through several distinct phases of emotion: disbelief, comprehension, and finally a kind of resigned acceptance that suggested he was beginning to understand the full scope of what had happened. Rebecca looked as if she were witnessing something that violated the fundamental laws of physics, while Amanda seemed frozen in place like a deer caught in headlights. "You bought our house?" Marcus finally managed to ask, his voice carrying a note of accusation that suggested he thought I had somehow cheated or manipulated the system. "I purchased the mortgage from Pacific Trust Bank," I corrected gently. "The house was in pre-foreclosure status, and I was able to negotiate a private sale that avoided the auction process." "May I come in? We have quite a bit to discuss." Rebecca found her voice at that moment, and it carried all the indignation and outrage she had been storing up for what was probably the most shocking moment of her adult life. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "There's obviously been some kind of mistake. Emma lives in the garage. She doesn't have the money to buy a house." I smiled at her with the kind of patient expression I typically reserve for clients who didn't understand basic financial concepts. "I think you'll find that there's been no mistake," I said, opening my portfolio and removing a copy of the deed transfer documents. "Everything has been properly executed through the appropriate legal channels. I have all the paperwork here if you'd like to review it." Marcus stepped aside reluctantly, and I entered the living room where I had spent countless holidays and family gatherings, feeling like an outsider looking in. But now the dynamic was completely reversed. This was my living room, my house, my property, and they were the ones who would need to earn the right to stay. I settled into the armchair that had always been considered my father's seat, the one with the best view of the room and the position of authority during family discussions. The symbolism wasn't lost on any of us, and I could see my father's jaw tighten as he realized that his traditional place at the head of family meetings had just been claimed by the daughter he had consistently marginalized. "Before we discuss the lease terms," I began, removing several documents from my portfolio, "I want to make sure everyone understands the current situation. As of this morning, I am the legal owner of this property. You are all currently occupying the house without a formal lease agreement, which means your tenancy is considered month to month under California state law." The legal terminology had an immediate effect on the room's atmosphere. This wasn't a family discussion anymore. It was a business negotiation with real legal and financial consequences. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably in her chair, probably beginning to realize that her usual tactics of charm and manipulation would be ineffective in this new dynamic. "However," I continued, "I'm prepared to offer all of you the opportunity to remain in the house under a formal lease agreement, provided we can reach terms that are mutually acceptable." My mother leaned forward slightly, hope flickering in her eyes for the first time since this conversation had begun. "What kind of terms?" she asked quietly. I opened the first lease agreement and began reviewing the key provisions. The monthly rent I was proposing was exactly at market rate for comparable properties in the neighborhood, which represented a significant increase from the mortgage payments they had been struggling to make, but was still reasonable compared to what they would pay for similar housing elsewhere. The lease would be for 1 year initially, I explained, with options for renewal based on compliance with all terms and conditions. The security deposit would be equal to 2 months' rent, and all tenants would need to pass a standard credit and background check. Marcus interrupted with barely controlled anger. "You're talking about charging us rent to live in our own house?" "I'm talking about charging market rate rent for a property that I own," I replied calmly. "This is no longer your house, Marcus. You lost it when you failed to maintain the mortgage payments. I'm offering you the opportunity to continue living here as my tenants, which is considerably more generous than most investors would be in this situation." The truth of that statement was undeniable, and I could see it sink in as each family member realized how much worse their situation could have been. A typical investor might have demanded immediate vacancy, sold the property to developers, or established rental terms that would have forced them out within months. I was offering them stability and continuity, albeit under completely different terms than they had ever imagined. Rebecca's response was predictably self-centered. "This is insane," she declared. "We can't afford to pay that much rent. Marcus doesn't make enough money to cover those kinds of expenses." "Then perhaps you should consider contributing to the household finances," I suggested mildly. "The lease allows for multiple tenants, and the monthly payment could easily be shared among several working adults." The suggestion that Rebecca might need to get a job and contribute financially to the household was clearly revolutionary thinking in her world. She stared at me as if I had proposed that she take up professional wrestling or become a circus performer. Amanda raised her hand tentatively, like a student asking permission to speak in class. "What about me? Do I need to sign a separate lease?" "You would be included as a tenant on the family lease," I replied, "which means you would be equally responsible for maintaining the terms and conditions, including the financial obligations." The implication was clear. Amanda's days of treating the house like a free hotel while contributing nothing to its upkeep were over. She would need to either start paying her fair share or find alternative living arrangements that better matched her part-time income and casual lifestyle. My father had been silent throughout most of this discussion, but I could see him struggling to process the complete reversal of everything he thought he knew about family hierarchy and financial power. Finally, he cleared his throat and asked the question that was probably weighing on all of them. "What happens if we can't agree to these terms? Or if we can't afford the rent payments?" "Then you would need to vacate the property within 30 days, I answered honestly. "I would work with you to make the transition as smooth as possible, but I can't operate a rental property as a charity. If you choose not to lease from me, I'll need to find tenants who can meet the financial requirements." The finality of that statement settled over the room like a heavy blanket. For the first time in their lives, my family was facing the reality that their housing security depended entirely on someone else's goodwill, specifically, the goodwill of the family member they had spent years treating as an inconvenience and a burden. Rebecca made one last attempt to reassert control over the situation. "You can't seriously expect us to treat you like some kind of landlord," she said, her voice carrying the particular tone she used when she expected other people to bend to her will. "We're family. This whole business arrangement thing is just bizarre." I looked at her steadily, remembering every condescending comment, every dismissive gesture, every time she had made me feel unwelcome in what had been my childhood home. "Rebecca," I said quietly, "for the past 3 years, you've made it very clear that you don't consider me family. You've treated me like an unwelcome guest who was overstaying her welcome. Now I'm offering you the opportunity to continue living in this house under terms that are both fair and legally binding. Whether or not you choose to accept that offer is entirely up to you." The silence that followed was electric, with tension and possibility. I could see each family member weighing their options, calculating their alternatives, and beginning to understand that their comfortable assumptions about power and privilege, had been completely overturned in the space of a single conversation. Marcus was the first to speak, his voice carefully controlled but carrying an undertone of something that might have been respect. "How long do we have to decide?" "Take the rest of the week," I replied, gathering my documents and returning them to the portfolio. "The lease agreements are ready to be signed whenever you're prepared to move forward. In the meantime, consider this conversation your official 30-day notice that changes are coming whether you stay or go." I stood up and moved toward the front door, then paused and turned back to face them one final time. "I want you to know that I hope you'll choose to stay. This house has been home to our family for 32 years, and I'd like it to continue being a place where all of us can build positive relationships based on mutual respect rather than assumptions and hierarchies." As I walked back toward the garage, my temporary residence for just a few more days, I could hear the explosion of voices behind me as my family began processing what had just happened. There would be arguments, accusations, and probably a significant amount of blame directed at various people for various reasons. But there would also be, for the first time in years, honest conversations about money, responsibility, and what each person was willing to contribute to maintain the lifestyle they had always taken for granted. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and absolutely necessary. Whether it would ultimately bring our family closer together or drive us permanently apart remained to be seen, but at least now we would all be operating from a position of honesty about who had power and who was dependent on whom. For the first time in my adult life, I was the one setting the terms, and it felt extraordinary. Thursday afternoon brought the answer I had been waiting for. Marcus knocked on the garage door with the kind of hesitant politeness that suggested he was still adjusting to the new reality of our relationship. When I opened the door, he was holding a manila envelope and wearing an expression that managed to combine resignation with something that might have been grudging admiration. "We've decided to accept the lease terms," he said without preamble. "All of us. The signed agreements are in here, along with the security deposit." I accepted the envelope, but didn't open it immediately. Instead, I studied his face, looking for signs of resentment or hidden anger that might surface later. What I saw was something more complex. A man who had been forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about himself and his family, and who was beginning the difficult process of adapting to circumstances he couldn't control. "I'm glad you're staying," I said, and meant it. "This house works better when it's full of family, even if the arrangements are different now." Marcus nodded slowly, then surprised me by extending his hand for a handshake. "I owe you an apology," he said. "We all do. We didn't see what was right in front of us." The handshake was firm and genuine, carrying more respect than any interaction we'd had in years. When he released my hand, he looked directly into my eyes with an expression I had never seen from him before. Acknowledgement that I was someone worth taking seriously. "Rebecca wants to talk to you," he continued. "She's got some ideas about contributing more to the household expenses. And Amanda called that boutique manager about moving to full-time hours." Change, it seemed, was already beginning to ripple through the family in ways I hadn't anticipated. The financial pressure of market-rate rent was forcing everyone to reconsider their assumptions about work, contribution, and personal responsibility. Friday evening brought an unexpected invitation. My mother appeared at the garage door carrying a covered dish and wearing the kind of nervous smile she used when she was trying to bridge difficult emotional territory. "I made your favorite lasagna," she said. "I was hoping you might join us for dinner tonight." In the dining room. The dining room had always been reserved for special occasions and important family gatherings, meals where everyone was expected to be on their best behavior and contribute to civilized conversation. I had eaten countless meals at the kitchen table or in the garage, but formal dining room invitations had been rare throughout my adult life. "I'd like that," I replied, and followed her into the house that was now mine, but somehow felt more like home than it had in years. The scene that greeted me in the dining room was unlike any family gathering I could remember. The table was set with the good china and cloth napkins, but more importantly, everyone was present and accounted for. Rebecca had actually cooked vegetables to accompany the lasagna, Amanda had put away her phone, and my father had opened a bottle of wine that he typically saved for holidays. But the most significant change was subtle and profound. I was seated at the head of the table, in the chair that had always been my father's traditional position. Nobody had made a formal announcement about the seating arrangement, But everyone seemed to understand that the family hierarchy had shifted in ways that extended far beyond property ownership. Conversation during dinner was careful, but genuine. Rebecca asked thoughtful questions about my work at Morrison & Associates, showing interest in my professional accomplishments for the first time since I had known her. Amanda mentioned that she was considering going back to school to finish her degree, now that she understood the financial realities of supporting herself. My parents shared stories about their early years of homeownership, including struggles and sacrifices I had never heard them discuss before. Most remarkably, nobody complained about the new rental arrangement or expressed resentment about the changed circumstances. Instead, there seemed to be a collective recognition that the crisis had forced everyone to be more honest about their situations and more intentional about their choices. "I've been thinking," my father said as we shared dessert, "about what you said regarding mutual respect and positive relationships. I realize I never really asked about your goals or your plans for the future." It was a simple statement, but it represented a fundamental shift in how he saw me. For the first time, he was acknowledging that I might have perspectives and ambitions that were worth understanding, rather than simply assuming that my life was a series of problems for other people to solve. "I've always wanted to build something meaningful," I replied. "Not just financially, but in terms of relationships and family connections. I think this situation gives us an opportunity to create something better than what we had before." Amanda surprised everyone by raising her wine glass in an impromptu toast. "To new beginnings," she said, "and to Emma for seeing possibilities the rest of us missed." The toast was echoed around the table, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was truly part of a family rather than an outsider looking in. 6 months later, the transformation was complete in ways I had never imagined possible. Rebecca had not only found full-time employment, but had discovered a talent for event planning that allowed her to contribute significantly to household expenses while pursuing work she genuinely enjoyed. Amanda had enrolled in evening classes to complete her business degree and was managing the boutique's social media presence in addition to her regular hours. My parents had used the stability of the rental arrangement to finally address their long-term financial planning, working with an advisor to develop a retirement strategy that didn't depend on maintaining a mortgage they couldn't afford. The stress of financial uncertainty had lifted from their shoulders, replaced by the security of knowing their housing costs were fixed and manageable. Marcus had been promoted to project manager at his construction company, partly because the confidence that came from resolving his family's housing crisis had translated into stronger leadership skills at work. He and Rebecca had begun talking about eventually purchasing their own home, but without the desperate urgency that had characterized their previous financial decisions. As for me, the consulting work with Pacific Trust Bank had led to additional opportunities in real estate investment and financial analysis. My portfolio now included 3 rental properties, and I was being considered for a partnership position at Morrison & Associates. More importantly, I had discovered that being a landlord to my family had taught me valuable lessons about leadership, negotiation, and the delicate balance between authority and compassion. The garage had been converted into a proper office space where I handled my investment business and consulting work. I had moved into the master bedroom upstairs after Marcus and Rebecca found their own apartment, finally claiming the space and privacy I had wanted for so long. But I had also made sure that the house remained a gathering place for family dinners, holiday celebrations, and the kind of casual interactions that build strong relationships over time. On a quiet Sunday evening in spring, I sat on the front porch of my house watching the neighborhood come alive with the sounds of families enjoying their weekend routines. Children played in yards, neighbors chatted across fence lines, and the whole street had the peaceful atmosphere of a community where people felt secure in their homes and their futures. Amanda joined me on the porch steps, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of relaxed smile that suggested she was genuinely content with her life. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, settling beside me. "The way everything changed, I mean. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you had just helped us pay the mortgage instead of buying the house yourself." I considered the question seriously, thinking about all the ways that a simple financial rescue might have preserved the old dynamics while solving none of the underlying problems. "If I had just given you the money," I replied, "nothing would have really changed. You all would have been grateful for a while, but eventually everything would have gone back to the way it was before. The same assumptions, the same hierarchies, the same patterns that created the crisis in the first place." Amanda nodded thoughtfully. "And you'd still be living in the garage?" "Exactly." Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for people is to let them experience the consequences of their choices, especially when those consequences create opportunities for growth and positive change. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The evening was warm and peaceful, with the kind of gentle breeze that carried the scent of jasmine from the neighbor's garden. "I'm proud of you," Amanda said quietly, "not just for the business success or the real estate investments, but for the way you handled everything. You could have been vindictive or cruel, but instead, you found a way to help all of us become better versions of ourselves." It was perhaps the most meaningful compliment I had ever received, and it came from the family member who had been most resistant to the changes I had implemented. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from sleeping in a cold garage to owning the house where I had grown up. The transformation hadn't been just about money or property ownership, though those elements had been necessary catalysts for change. It had been about recognizing my own worth, standing up for my principles, and creating the kind of relationships I wanted to have, rather than accepting the ones that had been imposed on me. The girl who had stirred soup alone in the garage while listening to family conversations through thin walls was gone, replaced by a woman who set her own terms and built her own security. The family that had relegated me to the margins while taking their privilege for granted had evolved into people who understood the value of contribution, respect, and genuine partnership. Most importantly, I had learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the opportunity to discover their own strength, even when that discovery comes through crisis and challenge. The house behind me was quiet now, filled with the peaceful sounds of a family that had found its balance. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities, new challenges, and new possibilities for growth. But tonight, sitting on my own front porch in the neighborhood where I had always belonged, I was exactly where I was meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.